Welcome into Daily Insider. Stephanie Otey here. Kevin Rogers is out having a good time in Florida with his family. I'm here to take over for the rest of the week, and to join me today to discuss some NBA playoffs, some postseason, the play-ins. Mark Drumheller from Yahoo Sportsbook. We spoke not too long ago, discussed our picks midway through the season. I'm so interested to see where you stand now, because we were exactly on the same page, and now I'm getting a little bit nervous about what some of the picks I had at the halfway point in the season.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me back. And a lot has changed since we last spoke, right? The Sixers were riding high with James Harden right after the trade deadline, and everything was working well. And then they hit a little turbulence. And then we've kind of seen them sputter towards the end of the season, to the point to where a lot of people are very high on Toronto in this series in the first round. So it'll be interesting to see how they come out in that series against Toronto with so much at stake, in the first round of the playoffs.
Yeah, the Nets we were talking about this before we started recording. The Nets have been this team that everyone's hyping up. The star power is maybe the glitter's getting in everyone's eyes, but you and I seem to look past that. Sounds like we're still on the same page, but they did win last night. You and I both had them to cover there too as well. But looking at where they stand, how they played last night, they're looking to go up against Boston, a dominant team later in the playoffs. Just your projections for Boston or for Brooklyn at this point right now.
Yeah, I have a ton of respect for Kevin Durant and Kyrie, obviously, two incredible players. But I did jump all over Boston when the odds came out last night. I got them at minus 105 to win the series. Boston is a team since the All-Star break, 17-5. And a lot of times you think of Boston and you think of the defense, right? They have the best net rating defensively in the NBA. But since the All-Star break, they are number one in net rating, number one in offensive rating since the All-Star break. So 122 points per 100 possessions. So Jason Tatum, that offense, they're sharing the ball. They're doing everything the coach is asking for them, and it's paying off in big dividends. And we saw them in Brooklyn go head-to-head, during the season. Jason Tatum put up like 53 points in that game. And that's exactly what the playoffs are about. It's about the star players elevating their game and which star player is going to carry their team through to the next round. And I think, Jason Tatum's poised for a huge postseason.
Yeah, you mentioned since that All-Star break, that right around that point is when we last spoke. Like you mentioned, number one in offense, also number one in defense. We've known they've been dominant on defense all year, but since that point, also the best record in games against teams over 500. I mean, the Celtics really hit their stride. They were dominant down the stretch. You mentioned Jason Tatum. He can really shoot. Are you concerned about them being out Rob Williams though? I mean, that injury could really hurt them.
It does. It does hurt them. And, you heard Durant and the Nets talk about that in the post game. They got a little bit excited about, Theus and Horford saying that they're going to be able to take advantage of in the paint. And Durant told them, we're not going to talk about the opponent. We respect our opponent. He knows it's going to be a tough series. And it is going to hurt them a little bit. But I just think defensively, when you hear the Celtics talk about how they play defense and eventually it just wears on you. Like, they can't call every foul, right? So they're going to try and be physical with the Nets. They're going to bang them up. And I think we saw last year in the series against Milwaukee, Kevin Durant just kind of run out of gas a little bit. And you wonder, if fatigue is going to be an issue for him this year. He's logged a ton of minutes. And that's the struggle with coming from being a lower seed, having to play in the play-in, right? Boston is sitting back, getting rested, and they had to play the playing game against Cleveland, and now they're going to have to come in and play a tough series against the Celtics. But I just think defensively, they're going to be able to wear Brooklyn down as the series progresses.
Yeah, do you think KD is playing with shoes a bigger size this year too, after the way it did last year?
I know. Well, you know what? If he had smaller shoes, they might have counted that last one as a 3-pointer against the Bucks, which would have won them the game instead of sending it to overtime. But it is funny. But Durant, I think, like, listen, if you gave me one player to pick in the NBA, that's like, you got to win a championship this year, you want one player, it's going to be Kevin Durant. But I think the issue with the Nets is that him and Kyrie just can't do it by themselves. They have no bench. They've been turning the ball over a lot. They tend to get in foul trouble defensively. They're a little bit of a mess, and I just think it's going to be too much on Durant's shoulders in this series. Again, I expect a huge series out of Tatum. I think that, especially against this Nets defense, he's going to be able to do whatever he wants. And the Celtics are a team, like I said, 17-5, best record in the NBA since the All-Star break, have really hit their stride. And, I remember I wrote up an article for Yahoo right around that time that we spoke last time, where they were like 12-1 to win the East. Right now it's down to about 450, but I do think that that's a valuable play.
Yeah, looking at the odds right now for the East, I mean, the Nets, they have the third shortest odds to win the finals. I mean, where do you think this is coming from? Do you think it's the star power? I mean, it didn't go their way, and last year the Bucks got the best of them and then went on to win it all. But that series kind of looked like it was in Brooklyn's hands for the most part of it. And now, like, you look at their two-star players, KD's averaging 30 points a game, Kyrie's shortly behind at 27, but they've been in and out all season long. And I do wonder how they can withstand 7-game series throughout the playoffs.
Yeah, and it's going to be back to back, right? So that's the challenge that Brooklyn's in. I think, if you're talking one game, best players on the court, no fatigue, no nothing, everybody's even, then I think the Nets would be more valuable. But now, like I said, they had to play the play-in game. So Boston gets a little bit more rest. They were able to win convincingly, so they move on to the 7th seed. Now they're taking on Boston. That's going to be a tough series, right? And even if they are to get by Boston, which I don't believe they will be, they're going to have to take on Milwaukee, right? Assuming that Milwaukee beats Chicago. So the path becomes even harder as they go. And then they got to play in the Eastern Conference Final. So it's just very tough, like, coming from a bottom seed. And the road is probably going to have to go through Boston and Milwaukee again, back to back. I just think it's going to be too much for them.
And on the flip side, you and I both took Clippers to cover last night. Didn't go our way. An interesting game as to when you look at a protest happening courtside with a protester gluing their hands to the court. Did you stay up for that? I know you went to bed early, but did you see that?
Yeah, I did see it. Yeah, and I read all about it in the morning. So I mean, I guess that's the point of protesting, right? Is you want to bring awareness to things that are happening. And apparently, the owner of Minnesota has some business practices in regards to the ventilation shutdown of animals and that are pretty horrific. And she wanted to bring attention to it and for people to know about it. She made her point. People, I think more people are aware of it because of her, but it's just crazy to see that kind of happen in the middle of a basketball game. And, you have to worry about, like, the court. Like, the last thing we want to see is, players getting injured because because the court was, doctored or whatnot, with glue or what, so you worry about the player's safety. But, if her point was to bring awareness to these business practices, then she definitely made it, because it had me looking up, what was the protest about and trying to figure out, what her intent was there. But, luckily they're able to get her off the court in pretty swift manner and, kind of move on with the game from there.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the Twitter world blowing up over that game and the soft talk around Karl Anthony Towns. Did you read into that anything and some of the storylines about the practice, the infamous practice where Jimmy Butler just schooled him in practice and called him out being soft, and now everyone's like, oh, you can still bully Karl Anthony Towns. Have you read into that at all?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I think that Anthony Edwards has brought to this Minnesota Timberwolves team is he's given Anthony Towns more confidence, right? Karl Anthony Towns, has been kind of, the Jimmy Butler saga and just a lot of, just feeling like, he's had a lot of things going on in his personal life as well. And, there was a lot of questions about his heart and his desire. And I think, Anthony Edwards has brought a, swagger or confidence to this Minnesota team that you saw last night. Like, you saw down the stretch in a close game against a very tough, Clippers team with Paul George. They finished the season very strong. I had thought that they were going to win the game outright. I thought the 3.5 points was a gift, but you saw Edwards and the team hit their shots down the stretch. And, Minnesota is a franchise that really doesn't have a lot to celebrate. I know that they're the brunt of a lot of jokes because they were, so excited to kind of make the playoffs and to advance, through it in the play-in tournament. But that's a franchise that has just been consistently in the cellar, and people, wondering when they're ever going to get out. And it's good to see Edwards kind of elevate the franchise and to really help the play of Karl Anthony Towns as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Clippers were able to guard him pretty well. Defensively, he didn't do a whole lot. He was quiet in that game. They do move on, though. They will be facing the Grizzlies, and we talked about them earlier as well. Looking at that matchup early on, I mean, the Grizzlies came out. They're young. They're well collected. John Morant looks phenomenal, but even without John Morant, they're still 20-2. I mean, they're a very well complete team. How do you think the Timberwolves will favor in that matchup?
Yeah, not well, right? So, what do we know about the Timberwolves? A lot of offense. They want to get down the court. They want to score. They don't play a lot of defense, right? I think they were 29th, defensive rating in the last 10 games going into last night, which is, a little bit why I like the Clippers in that matchup. But they're going up against a Grizzlies team that it can just lock you up with Jared Jackson Jr. and, Bane, and they have a lot of good defensive players there, which is why you see, as a collective unit, they're stronger defensively without Ja Morant. So when he's not in there, they can still play their type of game. They can still win. But Morant's a guy that we know in the playoffs last year elevated his game. I think he averaged 30 points per game in the playoffs compared to the 20 that he was averaging during the season last year. So he's a guy that is going to step up. I just think the Grizzlies can use the experience of last year of falling to the Jazz. I think they lost that series in 5 games, wasn't real competitive. Now they get to come back and build on that as the 2 seed. And I think they get a pretty advantageous matchup here with the Timberwolves. I wouldn't expect Minnesota to put up much of a fight in this series.
Yeah, looking at the play-ins tonight, Atlanta, they finished strong. I mean, looking at the way they closed out the regular season, 19-3 straight up in their last 22 home games. They are up against the Hornets tonight. They are favored by 5.5. Do you think that they will continue this stretch?
I do. So Atlanta closed the season very strong, right? Especially defensively. That's been the issue with them all year is defensively. They really haven't been good, but they were 13th in defensive rating. I want to say in the last 15 games of the season. So towards the end of the year, they started to have a little bit of success. And the big difference here is you look at, how these teams went through last year and their experience last year. Atlanta, we know, me being a Sixers fan, hate to say it, but it was a massive upset against my Sixers. And they were able to move on to the Eastern Conference Finals and play the Bucks. So they have that playoff experience where they can, dig deep if they have to in these later possessions in the fourth quarter, where Charlotte's a very young team. Last year, I think they played in the play-in. I think they got blown out by Indiana, if I'm not mistaken, and just not a lot of experience in this type of situation. So I think when you look at both teams, Trae Young, great, LaMelo Ball, great guard play on both sides. We're going to see a lot of offense, a lot of running the floor. We're not going to see a lot of defense. Charlotte's defense has just been awful in the half court. Centers have just feasted on them. So I'd look for Clint Capella to have a big game. He finished the season with a double-double. I think he'll be a big part of what Atlanta does tonight, just because, that's how you beat Charlotte. They're just not a great half-court offense. Centers, dominate against them. Very poor rebounding team. So I just think they're in a bad spot here with the Hawks. I think it's a little bit of a big number, but laying the 5.5. But I think I think that, they're going to be able to win this game pretty easily tonight against Charlotte.
Looking at the total as well in this one, it's the highest of the play-ins, 236.5. These two teams, they finished top 8 in offensive rating, points per game. The Hawks, though, they'll be out with John Collins. He averages 16 points a game. And then for the Hornets, they'll be out without Gordon Hayward, who averages about 16 points a game as well. Looking at the offensive power of these two teams with that high of a total, I do like the under. Do you agree with me here? Do you think that total might be a little too high?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think we're going to see a lot of offense tonight, but the other part of it is in these types of games, what do we know? The intensity ratchets up. A lot's on the line, especially now that we're in like the 9-10 games. Like in the 7-8 games, the loser still has an opportunity to advance to the playoffs. The loser tonight goes home, right? So, we might see them as we get to the fourth quarter. Possessions become more important. We typically see that in the playoffs. That would make me look to the under. But overall, I think we do see a lot of offense. The total was a side that I just didn't want to touch. I ended up just laying the 5.5 points with the Hawks. I feel like they're the right side in the game, but it's the highest total for a reason. I mean, both these teams are going to look to score a lot of points tonight. It's just hard taking an over in this type of spot with both teams needing to win to advance.
Yeah, looking at the other game for the play-ins tonight, Spurs and Pelicans. Pelicans here favored by 5.5. The Spurs, though, won the last meeting just a few weeks ago on March 26th in New Orleans. There was a 4-point difference there, but bookies have been leaning towards New Orleans. They pegged them as a 5-point favorite, despite San Antonio winning 3 of their 4 matchups. So do you think this could continue to go in New Orleans' favor, or do you think that the Spurs can get this thing back on track for them?
Yeah, I like New Orleans, to be honest with you. Like, as a team, I thought they were very underrated. I think, McCollum's done a great job with them, but I typically liked betting them during the season when they were an underdog, right? And they were undervalued. And I think here they're a little bit overrated as 5.5-point favorites against a Spurs team that's been very good to the number down the stretch. 9-1 against the spread in their last 10 games. So I think the Spurs have a clear path to win, and that's with DeJounte Murray. If he can get into the lane, which I think he will be against this New Orleans defense, I think really that's what makes the Spurs offense work. We saw Murray get his feet wet coming back after the illness against the Mavericks. Didn't shoot real well. I think he was 5 for 15 from the floor, but just using that game to kind of get his legs back so he can go all out in this one. And I think he's going to have a ton of success. The Pelicans average allowing, I think it's 36% of shots within 4 feet of the rim. So you can get in the lane, you can penetrate off the dribble. And I think that's what the Spurs need to do to win. And I think that's where Murray's going to have success in this one. So I don't know if they can win the game outright, but I'm happy to take the 5.5 points with the underdog here. I think this line is a little bit too wide. So I'm going to go with San Antonio.
Yeah, looking at these two teams, great defense on both sides. I think it might look a little different than the first game of the night. Do you like the total here on this one as well? It's 229 at this moment.
I would probably lean under in this one. Like, I just think that, these are two teams, again, that are going to try and, you look at the Pelicans and how they win rebounding, they want to play in the half court. So I would probably lean to the under. Totals are tough in these types of games because, again, this is two teams with not a ton of experience, right, in this type of situation. CJ McCollum gives, some playoff experience coming over from Portland. But as far as the total, it's kind of hard to predict, but I would probably lean under in this type of situation than over, just because of playoff basketball. You typically see the game get shortened, possessions get shortened as well.
Yeah, I want to get deeper into the playoffs look as well. We were pretty clear-cut 76ers and Suns to make it to the finals. Now things look pretty different, especially when you look up who the 76ers are going to be up against with Toronto. That seems to be a dangerous matchup between the two of them. When you look at it, Embiid, he's the leading scorer. We talked about liking him as the MVP, first center to be the leading scorer since Shaq. That may even have changed with the way Jokic was stepping up towards the end of the season. But the 76ers up against the Raptors, do you think this could be, a hiccup for them? Do you think there could be an upset? Because one thing that I see that makes me nervous when it comes to playoffs is how much they get to the charity stripe. They're getting a lot of points from the free throw line.
Right. I think that helps them. So, in the sense that Toronto is a team that wants to get in transition, wants to run the floor. You can't do that if you're inbounding the ball because the other team's shooting free throws all game, right? And I think that's going to be key is offensively, the Sixers can't get relaxed and can't just start trying to beat Toronto from the perimeter. They have to do what they do best, and that's Embiid inside, and that's Harden driving to the lane, drawing fouls. And that's going to be a big part of this series. But I like the Sixers. I think that a lot of people are off them. The betting market favors Toronto here. A lot of people think Toronto is a live dog to win the series. I'm not sure. Maybe it's my Philadelphia bias, but one of the things I think about a lot is this time last year we were talking about how the Bucks got an awful draw because they have to play the Heat, who've been their kryptonite, and they just wall Giannis off and make Giannis shoot from the outside, and the Bucks can't do anything against the Heat. What are they going to do? Everybody bet on the Heat, and Giannis breaks through those barriers and leads his team to the NBA championship. So we have to be a little bit cautious of, having too much recency bias. Like this type of the NBA playoffs is really about the star players, elevating their game and carrying their team. And it's going to come down to Joel Embiid and James Harden having the ball at the end of games and whether they're going to be able to execute, whether they have the drive, whether the distractions are going to get in the way. That's another thing. They can't sit there and yell at the referees for not getting all the calls, getting all the fouls. They got to play distraction-free basketball. They got to get to the line and they have to execute their offense the way they want to. But another player that I think we should really be focused on is Tyrese Maxey. I think he was the most improved player in the NBA, regardless of who gets the award. We've seen him make huge leaps this year. And he's going to be tasked with, Fred VanVleet, who obviously a very seasoned pro, does a great job for Toronto, but he's been battling a knee injury. And I think that, Maxey is going to have his work cut out for him on the defensive end, and they're going to need him to score and get buckets for them on the offensive end, especially with, Thibault being out in the road games against Toronto. I think that this is going to be a huge series for Tyrese Maxey, and I think you're going to see him step up. And just as much as we talked about Brooklyn and how difficult their path is to get out of the Eastern Conference, the Sixers are the opposite, right? It's almost like, not that Toronto is an easy draw. I think everybody in the NBA would have liked to play Chicago in the first round, but, they get Toronto, and then they're going to get probably the Heat, right? As long as the Heat, win their first round series. So I think that draw is much easier than what you see out of like a Brooklyn team that's going to have to go through Boston, have to go through Milwaukee. They're able to kind of avoid those teams in the first couple rounds, which I think is beneficial for the Sixers prospects.
Yeah, and the way that the two have been playing together, I think they're probably the most dynamic duo in the league right now. But do you think that Embiid solidified his MVP pick at the end of the season?
I don't. And I think, some of it was controllable and I think some of it wasn't. So I think Jokic is going to win the MVP. And listen, there's great arguments for both players. Like if you want to take like net rating when Jokic is on the court versus net rating when he's off the court, it's like a 15-point difference, which is greater than Embiid, greater than anybody in the league. So he, in the true sense of being valuable to your team, the stats bear out Jokic. But, I saw them go head to head and Jokic didn't want any part of Embiid in the post, in that game. So I think Embiid might be the better, more dynamic player. But I think where he slipped in the MVP was once things started to get away from him, the way the schedule played out. They had that one game against Milwaukee. And then they finished the season with a very easy schedule with Indiana, with Detroit, a lot of lower level teams kind of rounded out their schedule towards the end of the year. Again, nothing Embiid can control, but the fact that in that Milwaukee game, Embiid has the ball down in the paint with 2 seconds left in the game on the line, and Giannis blocks his shot. That's the lasting impact in a lot of voters that I think we're kind of on the fence of, do we want to vote for Jokic? Do we want to vote for Embiid? Because it was a huge game for the Sixers as far as like gaining ground in the Eastern Conference standings. And they ended up losing the game to the Bucks, and they lost, in part because Embiid got blocked with the ball in his hands with the game on the line. So I think that didn't help him. And I think so for that to happen, not that that was the whole reason that he lost the MVP, but it was slipping away. Then we saw that happen. And then he really he played outstanding down the stretch, 40, 50-point games, but he's doing it against lower level competition, which just doesn't bear as much weight with the MVP voters.
Yeah, and we see James Harden making his pick. He says that Embiid deserves it. It's not a fair vote. If you had a vote, who would you choose? I mean, I still see value in Embiid because he's now the underdog. But if you had it's a different way to look at it when you're betting versus when you'd be casting a vote. But who would be if you had a vote and you were one of those members that could cast a ballot, who would you pick?
Yeah, I would vote for Embiid. I really would, just because I think that historically, the way we've looked at the award, it's been more of the best, most dominant player than it's been the player that's truly more valuable to their team, right? The
Mhm.
Nuggets fall apart a little more when Jokic isn't there, but both teams fall apart when their players aren't there. If you've watched Sixers games, when Embiid goes to the bench, it's like, we watch 10, 15-point leads evaporate all the time. So I think that they're both very valuable to their team, but I just think Embiid has done things this season that we haven't seen players do, in history sometimes. And for him to win the scoring title as a center, to have the type of year he had, I think he deserves the award. He would get my vote, but luckily for Jokic, I don't have one. So, I think from a betting perspective, I think he's probably got the award wrapped up. But it just comes down to, when you're betting on these types of awards, there's a little bit of ambiguity as far as, what does the award truly mean? Are we really looking at the most valuable player, or are we really looking at the best player, the most dominant player? And that difference of opinion is what makes the difference, when they hand out these awards.
Yeah, I feel the same way when I'm looking at Heisman or any of those. There's so much that
Mm-hmm.
go into it. But even before the trade for James Harden, Embiid was putting up MVP numbers, like he was
Yep.
dominant for the full season. So I think that he established he is the guy on his team even before they gave him some reimbursements with the trade. And honestly, that just only helped his odds in my eyes because it brought that full team further with hopes
Mm-hmm.
for a playoff push. So
I think that
he would have
hurt
my
him.
vote too.
Yeah,
What's
I think
that?
it hurt him in a way that, like, Harden kind of
Yeah.
struggled down the stretch, right? So I think that, like,
Yeah.
because the Sixers weren't as dominant as they were when they first made the trade, I think the voters look at it like, oh wow, like Jokic is carrying this depleted roster into the playoffs, and people expected Embiid and the Sixers to surge to the top of the Eastern Conference, and they went through some growing pains with Harden that they're kind of still experiencing, right? That we hope that they get straightened out for the playoffs. But that chemistry and that continuity and learning to play together, I think the fact that it resulted in the Sixers not being as dominant really hurt Embiid, because the voters kind of looked at it as, well, he has James Harden, he has Tyrese Maxey, who's been coming on playing incredible basketball, he has Tobias Harris, he has better players on his team. So I think that kind of like shied voters away and kind of made them lean more towards Jokic as well.
Mhm. And it'd be interesting, like, it just really depends on who's voting, like, what if players voted? Like,
Hmm.
I think that Embiid would get it, the guys playing the game, I think that they all would say it was Embiid. I still see the value there. I really don't know if it's Jokic. I feel like it was Embiid's to lose, and in a way, I feel like it was kind of stolen.
Yeah,
Do you
kind
think
of.
it was? I feel like it kind of was. I mean, because it was his. It was like a clear-cut winner. I feel like he had negative
Mhm.
odds at one point, and then now he's the underdog, you know?
Yep. Yeah, it totally flipped, and like I said, it happened kind of like a little bit progressively, but I thought that game against Milwaukee was a chance for him to make his case on a dominant stage, and obviously the end of the game didn't play out the way he wanted to, but again, it's an award, right? Like, I know Joel's come out and he said, "Hey, listen, like, I guess the media hates me. I don't understand why they're not giving me the award. I don't know what else I can do." And I feel for him, and I think all that makes sense, but the one thing you can do to make the media like you is go out and win a championship, right? We've
I
seen
was
the
just gonna
narrative
say that.
change around Giannis is once Giannis won the championship, now he's like, the way we talk about him this year as opposed to how we talked about him last year is completely different. And he did that by injuring his knee, fighting through that in the postseason, carrying a team that really
Ugh.
didn't give him much support, and winning the championship. And now we view him as possibly the most dominant player in the NBA, much different than we did last year before he elevated his game and made those steps. So that's really what the NBA is about in the playoffs. That's what this postseason is going to be about. We're going to see other players kind of step up and change the narrative around their legacy. And I'm hoping that Embiid and Harden are two players that really have a lot of stake that way, because Embiid's window is probably only a couple more years. He's at his peak. And James Harden's a guy who that narrative of not being able to perform in the playoffs have carried him all the way throughout his career. And this is a big opportunity for both those players to change that. So I'm hoping that motivation is able to kind of, propel them to have a strong postseason and, hopefully towards a championship. As a Sixers fan, I would love to still see the parade.
Yeah.
But the Eastern
We
Conference
don't
is
sound
pretty
as
tough.
positive as we did just like a month or so ago.
I
But
know it's funny.
I think that they're the most dominant duo, and I think that this gives them both the juice because there's so much doubt on Harden in the postseason, and then Embiid. Literally, I feel like he got it ripped out of his hands almost, but I think that gives them the juice. I do think that they will top the Raptors, even though it is not being talked about. Everyone thinks it's Toronto's to win. I'm with you there. I think that will give them the juice they need, but I still can't doubt Milwaukee and Giannis. It's hard. I feel like they're an afterthought just because it's just like they're in the conversation, but it's like there's been other teams that have come into the mix. Like we talked about Miami also last time as well. They will be up against Atlanta. And when you look at Miami, I mean, they were the most impressive to become the 1 seed, I feel like, because 4 of the best players were out at chunks of time with injuries. And so, I mean, they have incredible depth. They can play defense. Butler, though, shooting has been a little bit off, 23 from 3 this year, not much better from half court or from mid range. So they may be able to be reliant on Tyler Hero, but I don't think that would be, a good lean for them to make something happen offensively. But when you go up against Atlanta, a team that made it deep into playoffs last year, losing to the Bucks with an injured Giannis as well, how do you think this matchup will favor?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, Miami against Atlanta, I think they'll be fine. As they progress throughout the playoffs, I think they're going to struggle a little bit. And a lot of it's about what you touched on, with Jimmy Butler, and they really don't have that go-to player. When you look at the other, teams that are going to be left in the hunt, whether it's Brooklyn or Boston, Boston has Tatum, Brooklyn has KD, the Bucks have Giannis, playoff basketball is about isolation at the end of the game. It's a close game. You need a bucket. The ball's in your star's hands. Is he going to be able to get the job done, right? When the other team knows he's getting the ball and he has to deliver. And I think you look at the Sixers, they can get the ball into Joel Embiid. Who's going to stop him? Only himself. He has all the talent in the world. He can do things on the basketball court nobody else can. And so like I said, you look at those types of players. When we get into that half-court offense towards the end of games, late in the fourth quarters with the Heat, are they going to be able to rely on Jimmy Butler in those spots to go toe-to-toe with Jason Tatum, to go toe-to-toe with Joel Embiid, back and forth, trading buckets with everything on the line? I'm not sure. I mean, I like Jimmy Butler as a player, obviously plays with a lot of intensity. A lot of people, were looking into the argument he had with Spoelstra, and he might not be, he might be wearing thin on another organization, which has kind of been the story with him throughout his career. But I think when it comes down to the playoffs and it comes down to the end of the games, I think that's what they're missing. Like, they don't really have that go-to guy. And I think that's why they're going to struggle. And I think they could struggle against the Sixers once they get past the Raptors.
Yeah, when I look at the teams and how they were seeded, the Bucks, for example, up against the Bulls, 2 teams going completely opposite directions. Granted, the Bucks did have their mishaps. They struggled defensively, but they're still a top team in both clutch offense and defense. It's the Bucks, they're the reigning champs. So I think they had the best draw out in the East, which was loaded with teams. Who do you think drew the worst seeding?
Well, I think it's tough to say. The worst seeding's tough, but I think, like said, Brooklyn's path is going to be very tough, and they made it tough on themselves. I had talked about a little bit about, if you were Brooklyn going into that last weekend of the season, right? Everyone was like, oh, they have to win because they want to make sure they're in the 7-8 game because they don't want to battle themselves from the bottom of the play-in tournament. But, it should they have gotten a little more rest from their players, towards the end of the year instead of having to fight for that, 7 seed, because now they take on, Boston, and they're going to have to take on Milwaukee. So I think they have a tough road. Milwaukee matches up very well, with the Milwaukee matches up very well with Chicago. So I think they're going to be fine there. But the Heat, I think a lot of people are undervalued and they kind of get looked over, but I think they're going to have a tough road because they're going to get Sixers in that second round if they get by Toronto. And then they're going to get, the winner. But I think the Bucks and the Celtics being kind of mixed in that 2 and 3, having to beat each other up before they get to the Eastern Conference Finals is going to be tough on both teams.
So we liked the Sixers halfway through season. They're at plus 600. The Bucks was shortest odds plus 2,200 or 220. And then the teams in the middle are pretty close. Nets plus 350, Heat plus 400, and the Celtics plus 425. I still like the Sixers at plus 600. It's good odds to take, and their path forward. I know everyone's giving them a hard time about Toronto, but as we just said, I think they can get past them, especially with the juice that Harden and Embiid have right now with all the doubters on them. So, are you with me? Do you like them to take the East?
I do. I think it's going to be them or Boston. I really do. I think, again, Boston, the way they've been playing towards the end of the year, it's kind of tough to disregard them as being, the best team in the East. But the Sixers, again, I think the path is very valuable, right? Because what has plagued them towards the end of the year, it's been, hey, learning to play with James Harden and James Harden finding his way in the offense and being able to do what he does best, right? And this gives them the opportunity in playing a Toronto and then playing Miami, before you have to play that winner of Boston and Milwaukee in the Eastern Conference Finals, I think helps because they can kind of like gradually build their way, up into that Eastern Conference Finals instead of getting a team like Boston or Milwaukee in the second round. So I think them drawing Miami is going to be very beneficial for them. I think they have a shot. They have a path. And like I said, these games, it's going to come down. The story of every, postseason is which stars come out of nowhere and elevate their game and make a huge impact. And if it's Joel Embiid that steps up, there's not going to be anybody in the East that's going to be able to stop him.
And out west, it's pretty clear that the odds are favoring the Suns plus 100, and the next jump is Warriors plus 400. And I think the health of the Warriors is a bit of concern. Their three best players have only played 12 full minutes together this full season. If they are healthy, it's a different conversation. But can you be reliant on them to be healthy to take the West?
I can't, because it's like, and I know Curry's going to play and he's going to come in that series and they'll probably win that first round series. But after that, you get a Memphis team, which I just think is a better team. I know the odds don't always reflect that, but I think Memphis, the way they play defense, is going to be able to give Golden State all they can handle. So I think it's going to be probably very chalky out west. One of the upsets that I was kind of looking at, and which is a very interesting series, is the Dallas Mavericks and the Utah Jazz, because I thought Utah was a team. Yeah, Utah is a team that just has kind of is falling apart. The culture of the team doesn't seem real great. Coach not getting along with Donovan Mitchell, the star player. People are wondering if he's just kind of planning an exit strategy. Gobert not getting the ball when he needs to towards the end of games. Mitchell is just kind of jacking up threes when he wants. So the culture of that team just seems to be a mess. It's hard to imagine them being very focused. But I think they caught a massive break with Luka Doncic getting injured, and that makes that series very interesting, right? Because if Doncic can't come back and can't play at all in that series, then you have a Utah team that I think everybody was looking to fade, is probably the better team on the court, with Dallas without Doncic. So whether Doncic can come back and contribute in that series is going to be huge for how it plays out.
Yeah, that the Luka going down, their odds are now. I was looking at him like maybe I should take the Mavs because the odds are plus 1,800. I feel like that looks good, but with their star guy hurt, I don't have any doubts that he'd play through it. I mean, it just makes me nervous. But the West I feel like it's up for grabs other than going through the Suns. Someone could upset them in a 7-game series. The Bucks did it, and they had an injured MVP. So I feel like someone could take it, but I feel like it would go towards the Grizzlies. They're young, and I think that they could be the team that would upset someone. I think they could be the surprise of the postseason.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they're so dominant on defense, and again, they have the star player in Ja Morant, and I think that really this year they learned to play very well as a team, and I think that they're a team a lot of people have to watch out for. When you have a star player like that who lives for the moment in the playoffs, he can get it done. And, they have some good defensive players with Jaren Jackson Jr. I like them. I think the West is going to be pretty chalky. Like, I think these favorites are going to win in the first round. In the second round, um, we'll see how it kind of plays out. But I think it's probably going to still come down to, the Suns and the Grizzlies in a 7-game series. And in that series, I just think that the Suns, barring they stay healthy, just have so much depth. Like, they have a guy like Mikal Bridges who they can just put on your best offensive scorer, one of the best defensive players in the league. And of course, with Booker and Paul, they have so much offense. Cam Johnson and Cam Payne. They just have so many players. They can play 8, 9, people down in their bench. And when we get into these 7-game series, especially towards the end, if we're talking about the Western Conference Finals, that it's going to work wonders in them staying healthy and staying fresh throughout that series. So, I still like the Suns to come out of the West. I think it's going to be pretty chalky. Not a lot of upsets, not a lot of opportunities, unless you want to jump on Dallas and bank on Doncic coming back.
The interesting thing when I'm looking at the conference champion, the odds, you get better odds with the 76ers to win the East plus 600 than you do with the Grizzlies to win the West at plus 500. Granted there's less to get through basically, but isn't that interesting with the way the 76ers have been with their duo that they got? They're well rounded. The Grizzlies are too, but you get better odds with the Sixers.
Yeah, you do, and it's interesting in how the two conferences, when you look at the teams, kind of match up. And like I said, with the path, but the Sixers and the Grizzlies, I think, are two teams right now probably undervalued in the market. I think Memphis has been undervalued all year, to be honest. And like I said, a lot of people, the odds, started to shift as Golden State kind of fell apart towards the end of the year. But I just think a lot of people have been sleeping on Memphis for the majority of the time. And if there is one team, I think they can give Phoenix all they can handle, I do think it's the Memphis Grizzlies. And, you look at the East, and I think a lot of people have seen the Sixers kind of struggle in the playoffs. I think last year's letdown kind of is still fresh in the mind, of a lot of people. And I think a lot of people are running from the Sixers, as far as, coming out of the East, just because of the way Harden's looked down the stretch, Doc Rivers' history in the playoffs, blowing big leads, all those things kind of factor in. And that's recently what those, bettors have seen. So I think you're going to see the market kind of move away from Philadelphia until they go out and prove it this week, next week against the Raptors. And I think that's really can change things if you see a team really step up in the playoffs and play their best basketball. And I think that's what we're going to get with the Sixers.
When you look at the Sixers and the chip they have on their shoulder, who has the most to prove? Like with this postseason, who do you think has the biggest chip on their shoulder, or who could put the doubters to rest the most? Would it be Doc Rivers? Would it be James Harden? Or would it be Joel Embiid for not getting MVP if that ended up to be the case?
Yeah, there's an argument for all three of them, but I think the player with the most on the line is James Harden, right? Because, just his legacy, like throughout his career, was always a guy that came up small in the playoffs, always a guy who, didn't really get along with his teammates, right? Didn't play well in the sandbox. We all know the arguments and the fights he used to have with Chris Paul in Houston, and those teams were teams that really could have competed for a championship if there was more continuity, or should I say chemistry, between their two star players. So I think he's running out of time. Like if this Sixers deal for James Harden ends up being a failure, if he has a bad series and they get bounced out in the first round, I think it brings a lot of questions just about his career and how he's going to be remembered as a player. Even though I think Embiid's window is smaller, he's still coming off a season where he's the scoring champion and, probably has a better chance. The conversation will be in the off season of, do we have the right pieces around Embiid? And, do we need to move away from James Harden if they lose in the first round, as opposed to, so it could be tougher on Harden if he doesn't deliver, where Embiid's still going to have a couple more years to kind of get it done.
Who goes first if that's the case, if they lose to the Raptors? Doc Rivers, because there's
Doc
rumors he's going to the Lakers. Yeah.
Yeah, Doc Rivers might not make it through the series if they lose a couple games, to be honest. The way Philadelphia fans are calling for his head, and again, it's how do you behave differently now that it's the postseason and now that everything's on the line is going to be the big question, and that's going to be for Doc Rivers, because one of the most head scratching parts about his coaching is they get big leads and then he sits all the top players, and then he puts out these bench rotations that is just pretty much the bottom of the bench, and the other team gets back into the game. Well, when you're in a playoff situation, your bench typically gets shortened. You don't really go to play at the bottom of the bench, and you're usually doing 6-7 man rotations anyway for the majority of the game. So I think that that's going to be a key. I think Doc Rivers really has a lot to prove this year, and in this series it's going to start with that, especially not having Tybal. But I think that even if he does fail and gets fired, he's going to be able to find a job. He has a world title.
Mhm.
It's not going to be the end of it. Where James Harden, like if this turns into a total failure, if Harden has a bad series and they get bounced out in the first round, as much as Daryl Morey has shown he believes in James Harden, does he have to move on from him? And if he does, what kind of market's going to be there? So I think that Harden would be the big loser there. I think that Rivers would definitely lose his job if they lose in the first round. I think they'll go in a different direction as a coach. And Embiid is the guy that they're going to continue to build around. When you have a center that is dominant as him, that can, shoot from the perimeter and terrorize everybody in the paint and put up 30 points a game. You ride that until the wheels fall off. My concern with being a Sixers fan is big men don't usually last that long in the NBA. So how many years is it going to be before the wheels fall off? We know Embiid has had trouble staying healthy in the past. So that's why I want the Sixers to capitalize this year.
Yeah, and when you think about if you go to LA with the Lakers, benching stars is kind of LeBron likes to sit on the bench sometimes, like maybe it'll be a match made in heaven. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's got to be, I mean, if you're a coach, that's got to be the worst place to go. Like LA, like that
And
franchise
right
just
now,
seems in
it ain't
such
pretty out there.
disarray. Yeah, it ain't pretty out there. And the other thing too is you're not really the coach, right? Like what LeBron wants, LeBron's going to get. Like Frank Vogel was the fall guy there, but everybody knows that LeBron James was behind a lot of the decision making that was made from a personnel standpoint, and it just seems like a place that you would go where you're in such a high profile market in Los Angeles with the Lakers, and you have one hand tied behind your back because you have LeBron James there, which is a double-edged sword because he is LeBron James. He's one of the best players to ever play basketball. But, it's a lot of chefs in the kitchen, and your influence there isn't where it is in other places. And I think that that's what, makes people kind of shy away from the Lakers at this point. So Doc Rivers, if he ends up in LA, if he loses in the first round, it might be a punishment more than anything else.
I know. I feel like, yeah, I don't think it would go well. When you see the LeBron, maybe LeBron's gonna shift the way this LA experiment went, but I can't imagine things going well. I am curious to see how that goes, but there's a draw to take the Lakers right now because the West is pretty open when you look at the way it's set up right now. I feel like you could get in there and make an impact. It's hard to be jumping into the East right now,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. There's odds and ends, but how much would you have? Would it be like a Bruce Arians type move where you get pushed up to the office if you try to have too much input with your all-star guy, with your legend on the team? So it's a very interesting dynamic. I wonder if that's who the Lakers will take as their head coach, but who knows? Lots to look into. NBA playoffs is the greatest time of the NBA season, postseason. Oh, before we end it, I want to know, are you in favor of these play-ins? Do you like them?
I do. I love it. I really do. And I think it brings a different dynamic. And I also think that it keeps more teams involved, right? Like, we looked at, teams like, the Pelicans and that have a chance now that might not have had a chance if it, was strictly just the 8 teams. And I think it gets more franchises involved. They're alive in the regular season longer. I think the NBA regular season is very arduous and probably, probably all get by as fans if it was 60 games, right? And not 80. But I think it's a long season, but it keeps those teams in it. And I think you saw that with the Sacramento Kings. They were very active at the trade deadline. Didn't work out, right? But, without having this play-in structure, there would be some of those teams towards the bottom would fade out quick and just start selling their players, and it just wouldn't be as much fun. So I think the way they structure it is good, that the 9 and the 10 have a very difficult road, have a more challenging road to actually get into the playoffs than a 7 would. So I think the fact that it's staggered like that's very good, but I do like that it gives more teams a chance for longer.
Can you imagine if the Nets lost last night?
I know. It's crazy.
So high on them, and then they lose the play-in.
I know. Well, here's the thing I was thinking is, you would almost, if I was the Nets, I think there would be a better scenario to kind of lose and then win a game and be the 8 and get to play Miami than having to draw Boston. And again, they're all competitors, so they don't look at it that way. Yeah. But me from the outside looking in, is being the 8 seed probably would have been more advantageous for Brooklyn, right? So they get Miami and then they get the Sixers, as opposed to Boston and Milwaukee, a much tougher road.
Yeah, but I mean, the Nets will take all the rest they can get too. I mean, they just, so yeah, it'll be interesting. I think we're still on the same page. We're still riding the 76ers wave. Seems like you're moving a little bit more east to Boston though. So
yeah. Well, my head says Boston, my heart says Philadelphia, but I think that it's just really a matter of, can Embiid take the playoffs over? And that's really what it comes down to, because if he does, nobody's going to stop him. Like, he's, like I said, he's the most dominating players in the game. So he just has to, from a maturity perspective, he just has to make that leap, right? We saw Giannis do it last year. We're hoping Embiid does it this year. And then he can change the narrative, and really, if they make a strong push through that East, if they knock out Boston, knock out Milwaukee, I can guarantee you he'll be getting MVP votes next year. Yep, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And longevity with Embiid has always been everyone's fear. Like, how much can he endure? But I think that the MVP snub is like all the juice he needs. Like,
motivation.
Yeah. Pain is a physical thing. I always tell people, if they're not runners, it's more mental than it is physical. You can put any type of pain aside if you want it enough. And I think Embiid wants it enough. So he could be playing.
He's got a lot to prove
in the world. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm excited. And like I said,
a lot of guys in Philly do have a lot to prove. So I think collectively, I think they will. I think that gives them the edge, actually.
Yeah. A lot of people in the hot seat, from Doc Rivers to James Harden to Joel Embiid. Embiid not on the hot seat, but, will be motivated, right? And, wants to prove that he's the best player in the NBA. And there's no better way to do it than in the postseason, because that's where everybody looks. Like I said, it can literally change the course of your career if you step up in these big games. And when these games are on the line against Toronto, he's going to have the ball in his hand. So he's just got to get it done.
If there's an exotic bet I could take for someone on the Sixers to get into an altercation because of this tension they have, because of how heated they are, I would take it. We've seen punches be thrown at the college level. I think that we could see it happen when the stakes are this high and there's that much heat. That's an exotic bet I would probably take.
Yeah, put some action on that. And listen, that these two teams, like the Sixers, I feel like are going into this like they have their back against the wall. And there's history with Embiid, with Toronto, right? We all remember, the Kawhi bounce off the rim, end everybody's dreams, and Embiid crying off the court after they lost that series. So here's a chance for Embiid to get revenge, So I think there's going to be, a lot of tension in this game. In this series, and I think it means a lot for both teams, right? Toronto wants to win just as much as the Sixers, but Sixers have a lot at stake, man. And I think it's going to be it's going to be a very tense series. So I think they're going to have something to prove.
Here's the one thing we need to happen so we can lock in the Philly pick. We need Drake back courtside in Toronto, wearing the jersey, and then we know for a fact that the Sixers will win.
Then we're doubling down for sure. If I see that, I'm doubling down.
Drake, get to Toronto and wear a Toronto jersey right now, and we're winning. We'll cash
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll be doubling down. Empty out the account. But hopefully we get it. Hopefully the Sixers can get through this series and like I said, then build momentum into, as they get into the next round, because I think Miami is a team that they match up very well with, like I said, with Butler and, with Embiid in the middle. I think they can do a lot of things against that Miami team, especially at the end of the games. But it's going to come down to Harden and Embiid. That's why we made the trade. Those two players, they have to step up and get the job done.
Well, I'm going to be cheering like crazy. Like I said, I'd go to the parade if Philly wins. I'm all in on the Sixers. I'm completely fading the Nets. I'm not worried about the Toronto one. I feel fine about it, especially because the juice they got.
Yeah, I think Toronto's a real trendy dog right now. And I think a lot of times you see that it's a little bit of
better
recency
odds for
bias.
us. Just keep putting the money in Toronto and crank up the odds.
Keep talking about
us.
Toronto.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We'll cash it out bigger. All right. Thank you so much. I'm getting so pumped for the playoffs to go underway. You can catch Mark at Yahoo Sportsbook right here. Mm-hmm. He joins us all the time on Daily Insider. He'll probably be back. Kevin Rogers is still out the rest of the week. I'm back on tomorrow. I got Chris Farley on, and then Tommy Freeze Pops is joining me Friday to finish out the week. Marky, thanks so much for joining me, and good luck with your bets.
Thanks for having me.